It had been raining, the kind of rain Oxford knows best, thin, endless, and oddly intimate. It fell like memory, soft enough to hear between footsteps, heavy enough to make you wish for a forgotten umbrella. I remember walking past Exeter that evening, collar turned up, the crossword from the Times folded in my pocket, and Mahler's Fifth still lingering in my head. One always needs something to hum against the loneliness of wet stone. I'd left the Randolph earlier than usual. The whiskey hadn't been good enough to justify staying, and the company, what little there was, had reminded me that talk often ruins silence. I walked toward the High, past the yellow light spilling from the Bodleian, and thought of a word that could mean both end and answer. None came. The crossword remained incomplete, like so many things in my life. It was then that I heard them. Footsteps. Light, deliberate, and out of step with my own. I paused by the iron gates of Exeter, listening. Nothing but the rain. The rhythm had been clear, though an echo slightly delayed, as though the stones themselves were remembering me. I told myself it was the sound of water in the drains, or the peculiar acoustics of those narrow lanes. Yet the instinct one earns from years of listening to lies told softly in witness rooms would not let me forget it. When I reached the corner by the chapel, I turned. Empty street. Lamplight trembling on wet cobbles. A cat darted from under a parked car. The wind tugged at a torn poster about a lecture on ethics and justice. Ironic, I thought, though I couldn't have said why. Then I walked on. Slower this time, with that peculiar chill that comes not from cold, but from something that shouldn't have been. Days later, I was in my office, nursing the dregs of coffee that had gone bitter an hour before, when Lewis brought in the morning file. An elderly widow found dead in her house on Cranham Street. Apparent heart failure. Nothing suspicious, according to the uniformed man who'd attended. She'd lived alone, no family nearby. But there was a note of hesitation in Lewis's voice, a small uncertainty he tried to disguise behind procedural clarity. He said the neighbor had reported hearing strange noises, footsteps in the attic, days before the death. Not rats, she insisted. Footsteps, slow, human. The old woman herself had complained of them, apparently even called the housing office. They'd sent someone round who found nothing. I told Lewis to file it, though I found myself reading the report twice. Her name was Mrs. Beatrice Lomas, 78, widow of an Oxford porter. Quiet life, small pension, a history of insomnia. I could see her already, the sort who leaves the radio on at night just to feel less alone. That evening I passed Jericho on my way home, as if by chance. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened. The house was easy to find. Narrow, brick-fronted, curtains half-drawn, a single light burned upstairs. I stood across the street longer than I should have, thinking about the loneliness of small houses and the way echoes grow larger when there's no one left to answer them. It was then I noticed the upstairs window slightly ajar, though the reports had mentioned the house being locked. A careless detail, perhaps, or perhaps not. I made a note in my mind to mention it to Lewis. Later that night I returned to the crossword. The clue that had eluded me days earlier came back, echo of one's own making 5. The answer was ghost. Too neat, I thought, and too late. The next morning, the coroner's report confirmed natural causes. Cardiac arrest, no signs of struggle, no foreign substances. Still, something in me refused to let go of the sound of those footsteps. I told myself it was coincidence. But coincidences, in my experience, rarely stay that way. Before leaving the office, I found myself checking the street register for Cranham. The name of the landlord caught my eye, Oxford Housing Association. I'd seen it before. In a case years ago involving a missing student. I couldn't recall the details, only that the house had also been in Jericho. I closed the file, though not the thought. I walked home through the drizzle, the city quiet as a library after closing. Somewhere behind me, I fancied I heard again the faint sound of steps, measured, hesitant, almost kind. I turned, of course, and, Of course, there was no one there. I stood in the rain for a long time, listening to the water gathering at my feet. Oxford, I thought, has too many ghosts for a man to walk alone. The house on Cranham Street was narrow enough to make two men feel like an intrusion. Rain clung to the brickwork in a way that gave the place an air of long endurance. I remember Lewis saying something practical about damp rising through the lower walls. I nodded, though what struck me wasn't the damp, but the silence. There are houses that keep their dead quietly, and this one had learned the art well. Inside, the smell of stale air mingled with lavender polish, the kind of scent that belongs to women who write letters instead of using telephones. On the mantelpiece, a china cat stared with the blind patience of years. There was no sign of struggle. The tea things were washed and set neatly to dry. The bed upstairs had been made with military precision. And yet, beneath all that order, something refused to rest. Lewis walked ahead, his shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. He made small notes in his pocketbook, times, dates, witness remarks. I let him. It is a kindness to let a younger man believe in the completeness of facts. But my eyes had already found what his had not. A single dusty footprint on the third stair, pointing upward, not the smudge of a hurried step, but a deliberate one, made days before the dust had settled again. We climbed to the landing. The wallpaper had peeled in strips, showing old layers beneath, floral ghosts of other years. A door to the right opened into what must have been her sitting room. The table held an unfinished letter, the ink dried mid-sentence, addressed simply to E. The handwriting trembled slightly, as though the writer's hand had grown uncertain halfway through forgiveness. I read the opening lines twice. They spoke of reconciliation, or perhaps regret. The difference between the two is often a matter of timing. Lewis hovered beside me. He muttered something about relatives, about tracing next of kin. I told him to check the postmark on the envelopes by the window instead. None were newer than 3 months. Someone had stopped writing to her long before she stopped writing to them. The stairs to the attic were narrow and steep, the sort that make one's knees ache before the heart does. Dust floated in the thin beam of light that fell through the trapdoor. I climbed first. The air up there was dry and cold, and the only furniture was a small gramophone and a chair missing a leg. A cracked floorboard lay uneven beneath the window. I knelt to test it. It gave a faint creak, hollow beneath. Lewis thought I was looking for signs of rodents. Perhaps I was looking for something smaller, the kind of secret that hides between sound and silence. He switched on his torch. The beam caught, the window latch bright brass, new, incongruous among the rusted fittings. I said nothing. Sometimes the mind needs silence before a thought decides to be born. Lewis remarked that the attic hadn't been used in years. I agreed, though the gramophone had a faint circle of dust where a record might have lain recently removed. I thought of the widow's story, of footsteps above her head. If someone had come and gone through that window, they had done so quietly enough to leave only one print behind. Before leaving, I looked once more at the unfinished letter. E, it said. The ink blot at the end formed something like a tear or a musical note, depending on how one chose to see it. I folded it back carefully. Outside, the rain had eased, and a milk van passed at the end of the street. Lewis asked if I thought the woman's death was connected to the noises she'd heard. I told him that everything in Oxford is connected by guilt, by memory, or by the damp air that refuses to forget. He didn't answer, and I didn't press. We walked back toward the car. Behind us, the narrow house seemed to settle once more into its old posture, pretending to be empty. But I knew better. Some places hold their breath a little too long. That night, in my flat, I opened my crossword again. The clue read, newly fixed, yet not repaired. 6. The answer came at once replaced. I thought of the brass latch gleaming in the attic's gloom and wondered who had replaced what and why. The file on Cranham Street had grown no heavier, though the story beneath it had begun to swell with the quiet persistence of something unfinished. Paper has a way of lying, I've learned, thin, obedient, almost weightless, until one reads what has been written between its lines. Lewis had traced the ownership of the house to the Oxford Housing Association, a bureaucratic edifice as impenetrable as any medieval cloister. 3 names had once filled the tenancy register: a doctoral student, a music teacher, and a charity worker who had supposedly left for Nairobi and never returned. Their leases overlapped by months, their departures curiously neat. I've come to distrust neatness. It was the name of the music teacher that drew me, Evelyn Cross. The surname had a cold symmetry about it, a self-contained poise. I telephoned the music department at Magdalen, and a secretary, flustered, deferential, told me Miss Cross was rehearsing for a faculty recital. She spoke as if I ought to know her already. The music department smelled of polish and dust, and an almost devotional stillness. In the corridor, the faint sound of a piano carried through half-closed doors. Scales, first, then something older, sadder, a slow unraveling of Schubert that reached into the air and refused to leave. When I entered, she was sitting at the instrument, head bent slightly forward, fingers poised as though the next note might betray too much. I told her my name, though she looked as if she'd already guessed it. She had the kind of face that wears its calmness like armor. Her voice, when she spoke, seemed to belong to another century, measured, precise, faintly amused. She said she had known Mrs. Lomas for years. The widow had been fond of music, though less fond, apparently, of silence. In her last weeks, Evelyn explained, the old woman had become increasingly convinced that someone lived above her, someone who moved at night, shifting furniture, playing a gramophone that had long been broken. Evelyn smiled faintly as she told me this, the sort of smile that doesn't travel to the eyes. She said Mrs. Lomas had become paranoid. Age, isolation, perhaps guilt. People invent ghosts when real company deserts them. I watched her fingers trace the rim of a teacup that wasn't there. I asked when she'd last seen the widow. 2 weeks before the death. A polite visit, she said. Tea, conversation, the usual mixture of memory and complaint. Nothing remarkable, except the widow's insistence that she could hear someone breathing through the ceiling. Evelyn had tried to reassure her. She had even gone upstairs herself, looked in the attic, found nothing but dust. Then, with that same detached kindness, she told me she'd felt foolish afterward. But the widow, she said, had whispered before she left, "Someone's still here." The phrase lingered in my mind like a faint echo inside a cathedral. Lewis would have called it delusion, of course. He would have ticked a box and written senile distress. But there was something about Evelyn's tone that unsettled me, not the words, but the practiced balance of them. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed grief until it became performance. As she gathered her sheet music, I noticed a small pencil mark in the margin of 2 initials intertwined, E.L. It was the kind of detail one might overlook, but I've spent half my life noticing the things people forget to erase. I asked her about the other tenants. She hesitated just long enough. The doctoral student, she said, had been withdrawn, rarely seen. The charity worker, Edward Lang, was charming, erratic, fond of poetry and wine, and, she added after a pause, fond of Mrs. Lomas too. She didn't mean romantically, she insisted, though she spoke as if the line between kindness and intimacy were one she'd often considered. I let her words settle. Then I asked whether she'd known Lang well. Her reply came too softly to convince me. Only through the widow, she said. He'd written letters from abroad, Kenya. Perhaps, but they stopped abruptly. No one knew why. The house, she remarked, had a way of forgetting its tenants. Outside, the afternoon light had turned the college walls to bronze. I lingered by the quad, thinking of that faint musical phrase she'd been playing earlier, a fragment I couldn't place. It hovered in my mind, unfinished, like the letter on the widow's table. When I returned to my flat, I found the crossword waiting, patient as ever. Voice that returns from the past. 5. The answer came easily. Echo. I wrote it down, though I already knew I'd met one that day. It was one of those afternoons when Oxford seemed to lean inward upon itself, the sky pressed low and colourless above the roofs, the bells of Christ Church sounding like an elegy for something unnamed. I had gone to the archives, not out of duty but out of restlessness, that peculiar hunger for pattern which, when starved too long, begins to gnaw at a man's sleep. The university archives occupy a narrow wing behind the Sheldonian, a place that smells of linen, candle smoke, and the slow decomposition of secrets. The assistant on duty was a pale young man whose politeness bordered on apology. I gave him the address in Jericho and a rough date, mid-70s. The years when everything went faintly brown, and he returned after some time with a stack of housing ledgers and a single folder labeled Cranham Street, refurbishments and tenancy images. It was the photograph that caught me. 5 figures standing before the narrow house, squinting into the light of another decade. Students, from their posture and careless neatness, 3 men, 2 women. The kind of photograph one might take before exams, before the dispersal that life demands. Yet one of the faces had been defaced, literally, violently. A thick cross of ink scored through the upper half of the image, erasing it with surgical precision. The rest smiled as if nothing were missing. Below the image ran a typed list of names. All first initials and surnames, except one, between D, Harrow and F. Pennington was a blank space where the letter should have been. Only the surname remained. Lang. I've always distrusted coincidence. The name had appeared once before, in conversation with Evelyn Cross. Edward Lang, she'd said, the charity worker who went abroad and never came back. A man fond of poetry, fond of the widow, fond perhaps of more. The missing initial seemed suddenly less accidental. I asked the archivist about the photo's provenance. The image, he explained, had been taken as part of a departmental property survey when the house was briefly rented to postgraduate students in the music faculty. The attic, he added, had served as a small study room for one Dr. Arthur Mead, a name that rang with a dull echo of familiarity. I asked to see the faculty records, and there it was. Mead. Arthur Lawrence. Died 1981. Cause unspecified. Beside the entry, a small asterisk and notation subject of investigation, academic misconduct. The accusation, it seemed, had never been resolved. A missing thesis, a disputed authorship, a reputation quietly buried under the weight of polite discretion. I turned the photograph again. The man on the far left, tall, hair too long for the period, could have been Mead. The woman beside him might have been the widow. Younger then, with that unmistakable set of jaw I'd seen in her portrait on the mantel. The scratched-out figure stood between them, one arm draped across another's shoulder. Erasure, I thought, is sometimes more deliberate than memory. The archivist brought me a folder of related correspondence. Most of it was procedural, but one letter stood out, a carbon copy of a note Mead had written to the faculty dean. It referred to a thesis entitled The Silence Between Notes. The phrase stirred something in me. Silence, after all, is never empty. It holds the shape of what it replaces. As I left the archives, the rain had begun again, thin and silver against the pavements. I walked toward Broad Street, thinking of the widow's attic, the gramophone, the cracked floorboard, the new brass latch. The attic had been a study once. A scholar had sat there, writing about silence, and then vanished from history. At a cafe window, I paused to watch the reflection of passing umbrellas. My own face looked pale beside them, blurred by condensation. For a moment, I thought of the photograph again, the scratched face, the missing letter, and wondered which was worse. To be remembered inaccurately, or not at all. When I reached home, the evening paper lay unopened on the table. The crossword waited with its quiet patience. The clue read, 1 removed from the picture, 5. The answer, of course, was erased. I wrote it in, then poured a measure of whiskey, listening to the silence that followed. It was not empty. It never is. The night before the recital I slept poorly. Some fragment of an old dream, a corridor without end. A door that opened only in silence kept me turning beneath the sheets. When the dawn came, pale and reluctant, I gave up on sleep and watched the light gather across the rooftops like dust over old paper. Oxford has that trick of appearing newly born and ancient in the same hour. It makes one believe that time can circle back, that certain mistakes might be revisited and undone, but I've lived long enough to know it never does. The neighbor had come that afternoon, a woman of the practical sort, her coat still damp from hanging laundry in bad weather. She told Lewis that before the widow's death she'd seen someone, a woman in white, standing in the attic window. The house was supposed to be empty. The description was imprecise, as such things always are. She couldn't say the hour, only that the light was odd, neither dusk nor dawn. When pressed, she added, almost apologetically, that the woman might have been holding something, a handkerchief, perhaps, or a sheet of paper. She hadn't mentioned it earlier. She hadn't wanted to seem fanciful. Lewis dismissed it as misperception, a trick of light through curtain lace. But the phrase stayed with me, a woman in white. The kind of image that clings to the edges of reason, hovering somewhere between the rational and the remembered. That evening, I found myself at Magdalen, though I'd no clear reason to be there. The recital had already begun. Through the half-open doors of the hall came the first hesitant notes of Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major, music so tender it felt almost indecent to intrude upon it. Evelyn Cross was at the piano, her figure composed and still beneath the lamps. I took a seat at the back, unseen. There is a peculiar cruelty in great music. It makes one aware of everything one has lost the vocabulary to express. Evelyn's playing was exact, but somewhere beneath the precision lay restraint, a kind of silence yearning to be broken. When she paused between movements, her hands hovered above the keys longer than necessary. It wasn't the showmanship of a performer seeking effect. It was thought, hesitation, or perhaps memory intruding. A pause, too deliberate to belong to the music alone. In that small suspension of time, I remembered the neighbor's description. A woman in white. A stillness framed in the attic window. The widow's voice whispering, "Someone's still here." My pulse quickened with the faint irritation of intuition, that restless flicker one learns never to ignore. After the final chord faded, I waited as the audience dispersed, a low hum of applause. Polite words, the rustle of programs folded into handbags. Evelyn gathered her sheet music with a care that bordered on ceremony. When I approached, she greeted me without surprise, as though my presence had been expected, even arranged. I told her the performance was beautiful, though I doubted she believed me. She asked, quite calmly, what I wanted to know. I mentioned the widow, the attic, the neighbor's story. For the first time, her composure faltered. Not visibly, no sudden tremor or avert of eyes, but in the faint tightening of breath, the kind one notices only when one has trained for years to hear what isn't said. She admitted that she had visited the house once or twice in recent months. The explanation was evasive. Couched in half-finished phrases, she'd gone to deliver music, to collect a book, to check on the old woman, who had been, she said, fond of company. But when I asked why she had gone again, shortly before the death, her voice turned to silence. The truth often hides in that last unspoken syllable. Outside, the rain had returned, tracing the stone archways with delicate insistence. We walked together to the gate. She mentioned the word haunting lightly, with an ironic smile, then left me standing there, the echo of her heels dissolving into the cloister. Back at my flat, the memory of her pause, those few seconds between notes, replayed in my mind, like a needle catching on a record. I poured myself a small whiskey and opened the crossword from the morning paper. One clue stood unanswered. Presence mistaken for absence. 5. I stared at it for a long while. the sound of rain filling the gaps between thought. The answer arrived quietly, as such things do. Ghost. I wrote it in, capped my pen, and sat for some time without moving, the word staring back at me, not because it was clever, but because it felt true. The letter had been folded and unfolded too many times. The creases ran like veins across the paper. The ink bled faintly at the edges where a hesitant hand had paused. Forensics sent me their findings late that afternoon. The writing matched the widow's, the ink from a bottle found on her desk. They'd managed to reconstruct the unfinished lines, and it was Lewis who read them aloud with a kind of reluctant reverence. "You were right. The floor remembers everything." I asked him to read it again. He did. Slower this time, the syllables catching in that small northern burr of his. The words refused to settle into any rational shape. They carried weight disproportionate to their brevity, like a confession that doesn't name the crime. The phrase had the ring of poetry, or something trying to be poetry. I told Lewis to check the drawers for any volumes of verse, and he returned with a dog-eared copy of Auden. I knew the line before I opened it. Those who hear footsteps when there should be none are guilty of memory. It wasn't an exact quotation, but near enough to make me certain that Mrs. Lomas had read him. She had written her letter not to a living person, but to her own past. Later, over coffee that tasted of chalk, Lewis mentioned that the charity worker, the missing tenant, had vanished the same year as the plagiarism scandal at the music faculty. He'd found an old article tucked in the housing records. Academic career in ruins after accusation of theft. The name beneath it was familiar Dr. Arthur Mead, the musicologist whose attic study we had disturbed, but the byline, that was the surprise. The reporter's name was Edward Lang. I remember sitting back in my chair, the kind that complains even under thought, and feeling the air shift a little. Lang, the charity worker. The missing tenant. The man whose photograph had been scratched out of the archive print. I asked Lewis to confirm the timeline. Lang disappears in late 1981. The widow rents the house shortly after. The attic sealed, the brass latch fitted. And Evelyn Cross appears in Oxford the following year, employed part-time at the music department. Cross, née Lang. I didn't tell Lewis the rest. That when I'd met Evelyn, her expression at the mention of the attic had been less surprise than weariness, as though the question had waited too long to be asked. That night I couldn't sleep. The phrase from the letter circled endlessly in my mind, "The floor remembers everything." I thought of the attic's uneven boards, of the small hollow sound they made beneath my hand. Floors do remember. They keep the weight of every step, the faint grooves of movement long after the movers are gone. I poured myself a whiskey, sat by the window, and tried to think not as an officer, but as a man. What sort of guilt would make a woman write such words? Not fear of discovery, guilt older than that. The kind that seeps from loving someone too deeply, or failing to protect them. The wind stirred the blinds. Below, the street was empty except for the shimmer of rainlight on tarmac. Oxford, at such hours, feels less a city than a memory rehearsing itself. I thought of Evelyn's hesitation between Schubert's movements, that pause shaped like regret. Of the photograph's scratched face, the name without an initial. Of the attic's silence, thick as confession. And slowly, uneasily, a pattern began to form. Not proof, but direction. When morning came, I returned to Cranham Street. The house stood as before, blind and narrow. Inside, the air felt changed lighter, almost forgiving. I climbed to the attic once more and stood beneath the slanted beam where the widow's letter had been found. There was a faint scent of dust and old varnish. I knelt and ran my fingers along the floorboards. The sound it made was not hollow now, but deep, a low, resonant note, like the echo of something buried with care. Perhaps she had written the letter not for Evelyn, but for him. Edward Lang, the brother who vanished, the man whose name had been rubbed out of every record. The widow had known, or guessed. She had hidden what needed hiding. And the floor, faithful witness, had kept its silence. I straightened, brushing dust from my hands. Lewis called from below, asking if I'd found anything. I told him only that I had found what wasn't there. He didn't understand, and I didn't explain. On the way out, I looked once more at the letter in its evidence sleeve. The words glimmered faintly under the fluorescent light. You were right. The floor remembers everything. I thought of Auden again, of that line about guilt and footsteps. The living walk loudly, he'd written, but the dead move without sound. Outside, it had begun to rain a soft, unhurried drizzle. I stood for a moment, listening to the sound of it against the stones. Somewhere above, in one of the upper rooms, a floor creaked. Perhaps the house was settling, or perhaps it was only remembering. By then, I had convinced myself that Evelyn was guilty. It wasn't logic that led me there, but a kind of emotional symmetry that the mind mistakes for truth. The widow dead, the brother vanished, the letter written in half-light, it all seemed to converge around Evelyn's silence, the pause between her words that felt heavier than confession. And yet, like any melody too perfect, it began to sound false the longer one listened. Lewis brought me her travel records the following morning. She'd been abroad, Bruges, Vienna, Prague, during the week of the widow's death. Verified engagements, even a performance program. The case I'd built on intuition and melancholy began to crumble like damp plaster. Still, something was wrong. The widow's letter hadn't been addressed to Evelyn at all, only to E. I'd assumed the rest. It's remarkable how often deduction begins as a form of vanity. I spent the better part of that day in my office, rearranging facts like musical phrases, hoping one might strike the right key. By dusk, my thoughts turned again to Dr. Harold Pennington, the former supervisor, implicated in the plagiarism affair. I'd met him once before, years earlier, at a faculty dinner where he quoted Virgil to a waitress and mispronounced both. A brilliant man, yes, but brilliance curdled when it goes too long unchallenged. His name appeared more than once in Mead's old correspondence, always in tones of grievance. I decided to pay him a visit. He lived in one of those tidy college houses near the parks, its garden neat enough to suggest a wife long gone. When he opened the door, I saw the years had been less kind than tenure. He was smaller than I remembered. Eyes like tarnished coins. He asked if this was about a parking ticket, and when I told him it wasn't, he looked almost disappointed. We sat in his study, walls crowded with books arranged by vanity rather than subject. He poured 2 glasses of sherry, though I doubted either of us wanted them. I told him about Mrs. Lomas, about the attic, about the thesis titled The Silence Between Notes. His fingers, resting on the arm of his chair, began to twitch slightly, the movement of a man keeping time with an internal metronome. He said Mead had been unstable, given to melodrama and self-pity. The plagiarism claim, he insisted, was nonsense, a misunderstanding inflated by gossip. He said it the way liars often do, not defensively, but with weariness, as if telling the truth had become beneath him. I asked if he knew Edward Lang. He frowned. Perhaps. The name was familiar. One of Mead's research assistants, wasn't he? Or a hanger-on. These students come and go, he said. They vanish when the work grows difficult. His dismissal struck me as too polished, too quick. I told him the attic had belonged to Mead, and that a woman had died recently beneath it, leaving behind a letter that spoke of footsteps and guilt. He smiled thinly, that academic smile reserved for undergraduates and fools. Guilt, he said, is an overrated currency. Everyone wants to spend it. No one wants to earn it. I let him talk, the way one lets a suspect believe in his own intellect. Then I mentioned something small, the Latin epigraph I'd found quoted in Mead's notes, a line from Seneca. Veritas numquam perit. Truth never perishes. He stopped moving. The air between us grew thick. The phrase hung there, faint as smoke. Then I added what followed in the margin of the missing thesis, a second line. written in another hand. Sed homines periunt in silentio, but men perish in silence. His glass tilted. A dark bloom spread across the carpet. His hand trembled, barely perceptible. When he finally spoke, the voice had lost all academic cadence. He asked how I knew that phrase. I told him I'd read it in the police transcript of Meade's final letter, though no such transcript existed. The lie felt justified. He leaned back, eyes closed. Then softly, almost kindly, he said, "You're wasting your cleverness, Inspector. There was no murder in that house, only remembrance." But he looked pale, almost stricken. And in that moment I knew he had read the thesis, every word of it, long after the university claimed it was missing. When I left, the night was brittle with frost. The lamps along Banbury Road shivered in the wind. Somewhere behind me, a piano played a fragment of melody. Interrupted mid-bar, a phrase unresolved, I paused on the pavement, notebook in hand, and wrote one word beneath Pennington's name: hesitation. It wasn't much, but sometimes truth enters like a wrong note, discordant, uninvited, impossible to ignore. The revelation came quietly, in the form of a sketch Lewis had made while cataloguing the housing records. He had traced the outline of the Cranham Street attic and, with patient attention, marked a narrow space between the window and the adjoining wall of the neighboring house. The diagram showed a gap, subtle yet sufficient, that the renovations had since sealed. A door that never existed, except for the absence it left. It was easy to overlook, and yet, in its imperfection, lay possibility. I went back that night. The street was nearly empty, the lamplight catching rain from hours earlier in scattered silver filaments. The house appeared still, obedient to its own shadow. I pushed open the garden gate, careful not to disturb the loose stones, and let my eyes travel upward to the attic window. Nothing but the dim reflection of streetlights. Yet I knew, as one knows an old tune, that it had once opened to another world, however briefly, allowing the impossible. Inside, the smell of dust and varnish greeted me, thick and stubborn, refusing to be swept away. The staircase groaned underfoot. I paused at the landing, listening for echoes in the dark. The boards beneath my boots creaked faintly, as though the house remembered more than its inhabitants. The window had been sealed, but the shape of that empty space haunted the shadows. A memory of access. I knelt on the floor of the attic, torchlight trembling across a narrow beam. Each plank was familiar from my previous visits, yet tonight they seemed to hold secrets in the small variances of wear. A hollow note whispered beneath one, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not paying careful attention. I pried it up slowly. The resistance of rusted nails and time itself yielded to patient persistence. Beneath the plank, I found two objects. One was a bracelet, corroded by age and neglect, engraved delicately with the initials E.L. The letters glimmered faintly under the torch, a whisper of identity that had been hidden for decades. The second was a fragment of music manuscript, brittle and curling at the edges. The notes were the opening bars of the silence between notes. Even in fragments, the melody seemed to hum with absence, as though it had absorbed the weight of what had happened here. I held the manuscript gingerly, tracing the lines with a finger that remembered piano keys more than crime scenes. There is a peculiar intimacy in paper that carries music, an intimacy that can speak louder than testimony. The arrangement suggested a hand trained in structure, yet hesitant in execution. Each bar seemed to carry a hesitation, a question that could not be answered except by those who had composed and suffered it. Outside, the night pressed against the glass. The houses across the street were empty, their windows unlit, yet the imagined crossing remained vivid. A person could have traversed that gap silently, stepping across shadows that have long since hardened into memory. And someone had. Or at least, the possibility of someone. I replaced the floorboard carefully, aligning it with the grain so as not to betray my intrusion. The house exhaled its old sighs. Each step downward carried the weight of understanding, the small recognition that the world rarely acts in accord with our neat assumptions. In the kitchen, I poured myself a measure of whiskey, unlit lamps casting faint shadows over the counters. I turned over the bracelet in my hand. E.L. The missing tenant, the vanished man, the brother whose presence had never been accounted for. And here, beneath the boards, the tangible remnants of a life intersecting with silence, music, and secrecy. The manuscript I held close. The bars were unfinished, the rhythm uncertain, yet unmistakably his. In a way, it was a confession without words, a record of absence and intrusion, of footsteps that the floor remembered even when its occupants did not. Outside, a breeze stirred the branches of the neighboring trees. Somewhere above, the attic window remained sealed, but the memory of its opening seemed to linger, as if the house itself had never fully closed the door. I stood for a long while, listening to the house breathe, the rain in the gutters, and the quiet music of possibility beneath the boards. It was not a resolution, not yet, but it was a trace, a note left in the air for those willing to hear. She came to see me just after dusk, unannounced, her composure arranged like music before performance. Evelyn always carried quiet with her, as though sound itself deferred to her presence. She said she wished to talk not officially, not as a suspect, but as someone who had grown tired of being misheard. We sat by the window of my flat, where the last of the daylight faltered against the glass. Outside, Oxford glowed in the aftertaste of rain. She refused the whiskey I poured, preferring her own silence. When she finally spoke, it was with the fragility of someone tuning a forgotten instrument. She said she had not killed the widow. I told her I already knew that, though I wasn't sure I did. She gave a small, weary smile, the kind that carries its own disbelief. She said she was guilty of something else entirely. Her brother, Edward Lang. The missing name. The erased face. He had come back years after everyone thought him lost, thinner, ill, his pride stripped bare. She found him one night standing outside the music department, waiting for her recital to end. He'd been living rough on the edge of Jericho, avoiding the kind of light that reveals too much. He asked her for nothing, only for forgiveness. She gave him neither, but she found him somewhere to stay, the widow's attic. I remember, she looked at me then, not for understanding, but for endurance. She said the widow had taken pity on him, offered him the space when Evelyn couldn't. He'd promised to stay only a week, but a week became longer, and his health or his will failed. One winter morning, he simply didn't wake. The widow panicked. She feared the police, feared the scandal, feared Evelyn's name being dragged through old mud. She sealed the body beneath the boards. The attic became a tomb, silent but never still. And for years afterward, she heard him faint movements at night, the sigh of the house remembering what she had buried. I asked Evelyn how she knew all this. She said the widow had told her in fragments over tea, in the long, hesitant way of someone unburdening herself while pretending not to. When the old woman died, Evelyn thought the past had gone with her. Then she saw the newspaper notice "Widow found dead at home," and she understood that guilt, like sound, doesn't vanish. It lingers, refracted through those who listen. Her eyes fell to the table, where the recovered music manuscript lay folded. The silence between notes. She said Edward had written it in the attic, a final act of reconciliation. I told her I'd heard it once, or thought I had, in the pauses between her playing at Magdalen. She looked at me, almost startled, and said that perhaps I had. He'd written it for her, but he'd never finished. The last bar had been left open, waiting for a resolution that life didn't grant. I wanted to ask why she hadn't come forward, why she'd let us believe in murder when it had only been despair and concealment, but her face already held the answer. Love twisted by shame, compassion mistaken for deceit. She said some truths are too brittle to survive daylight. They must be played softly. So softly that only the guilty can hear them. When she left, she paused at the door. The corridor light caught her profile, the faint tremor in her hand. She said, very quietly, that she still dreamed of footsteps, hers, his, the widow's, all moving in unison, never quite finding the downbeat. Then she was gone. I sat for a long time, listening to the silence she left behind. Outside, the wind brushed the eaves, carrying the faint hum of unseen wires. I opened the manuscript once more. The final bar hung unfinished, a phrase suspended in mid-air. I found myself completing it in my head, not musically, but in the way one completes a memory one has never truly owned. Later, when Lewis called to ask if we had our answer, I told him the case was closed. He asked if it was solved. I said that depended on what one meant by solved. After I hung up, I poured another whiskey and sat by the piano I rarely played. My fingers hovered over the keys but never pressed. Somewhere between the notes, I thought I heard a faint echo, not music, not confession, but something like understanding. And then, as so often in Oxford, the silence began to play itself. It rained again the night Evelyn played at the Sheldonian. The kind of Oxford rain that falls without direction, as though unsure whether it means to cleanse or to remind. The cobbles gleamed like mirrors, and the spires appeared fractured in the puddles, a city built on reflection, never on certainty. I arrived late, deliberately, unwilling to share the polite rituals of anticipation. The usher at the door took my ticket with a nod that implied familiarity. There are faces, I've learned, that know one's occupation long before one speaks. Inside, the air trembled with expectancy. The hall was filled not so much with sound as with its preparation, the quiet shifting of programs, the low hum of conversation, the rustle of thought. I sat at the back, as always, where anonymity feels most like belonging. From there, the stage looked impossibly distant, framed by light that turned every figure into a silhouette. And when Evelyn stepped into that light, the room stilled. She played the silence between notes, her brother's unfinished composition. The first bars moved hesitantly, like someone walking through memory unsure of the path. Each phrase seemed to search for what had been lost. I recognized fragments of Schubert, of Mead's early lectures on motif and variation, of the house on Cranham Street, with its sealed window and its whispering floorboards. The rain drummed faintly against the dome above us, a rhythm almost in time with the piece. Evelyn's hands moved with the precision of someone making peace with ghosts. The melody deepened, unfolded, then faltered just briefly at the same moment where the manuscript had ended. She held the pause longer than necessary. Then, instead of closing it, she let the silence play itself. That was when I understood. The composition had never been unfinished. It had ended where it was meant to in absence, a silence shaped deliberately, as if the final note had been too private for paper. When the performance ended, there was applause, of course. Prolonged, reverent, unnecessary. I did not join in. Applause is a form of forgetting. Evelyn bowed, eyes lowered, and left the stage without looking toward the audience. She had played not for us, but for the man she had lost, and for the woman who had buried him. Outside, the rain had thickened. Lewis waited by the railings, his coat collar turned up, hair plastered to his forehead. He looked uncomfortable, as though the evening had asked too much of him. He said something about closure, about how the case, if it could still be called, one felt sad rather than solved. I told him most cases were. We walked in silence toward Broad Street. The puddles reflected the college lights in broken constellations. Somewhere behind us, the sound of a piano lingered not from the hall, but from memory, still insisting upon its echo. Lewis spoke again, softer now. He said he sometimes wondered what it must be like to live with so much unfinished business. He meant the widow, perhaps Evelyn, perhaps me. I said nothing. At Carfax, he paused beneath a street lamp. He asked if I believed the widow had really heard those footsteps. I told him yes, or rather, I told him that the mind hears what it cannot bear to forget. The distinction hardly mattered. He smiled faintly, a gesture of resignation, not agreement, and wished me good night. His footsteps faded into the wet hum of the city. For a moment, I stood alone, watching the rain turn the pavement to shifting mirrors. My reflection wavered beside the blurred outline of the spires. I thought again of Evelyn's pause between movements, that exquisite moment of hesitation. The space where guilt had turned into grace. Somewhere within it lay everything that mattered: her brother's despair, the widow's remorse, my own unspoken complicity in understanding too late. When I finally turned to go, I heard it: faint but distinct footsteps. Light, deliberate, impossibly measured. I turned sharply. No one there. Only the sound of rain falling from the gutters, tapping against the stones in patterns too irregular for coincidence. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps the floor of the mind had begun to creak beneath its own weight. I walked on. The sound followed for a while, then dissolved into the rain. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and left the glass untouched. I opened the window and listened. The city murmured below, bicycles rattling over cobblestones, distant bells blurred by the weather, a world moving gently away from itself. Lewis's words returned to me, sad rather than solved. He was right, though he hadn't meant it as philosophy. Some puzzles aren't meant to close neatly. They exist only to remind us that knowledge changes nothing, that truth arrives too late for comfort. I looked out at the wet street, the faint golden ripples of light trembling across the puddles. The reflection of the Sheldonian dome glimmered for a moment, then broke apart under the weight of the rain. "There's no such thing as silence," I found myself saying aloud, "only the sounds we pretend not to hear." The city listened. Then, somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed once more, soft, unhurried, vanishing into the night.